Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 5 on effectively utilizing evidence. I'm Rob Glover, and this is for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. So today we're going to talk about how to utilize evidence in your writing. Begs the question, what is evidence? And it's a relatively simple answer. And if you've been doing any sort of writing at all, you've already been utilizing evidence in your writing. So today what we'll primarily be doing is going over ways in which we can be more systematic in how we think about evidence and ensure that the evidence that we use to support our arguments is the absolute best, most convincing evidence for our reader as possible. So evidence simply refers to information that you use in your writing to support or lend justification, to justify a statement or assertion. So if you're making a claim, you should be utilizing some form of evidence, and that evidence can take all sorts of different forms. That can be textual evidence, that can be expert opinion, that can be statistical data. Primarily in Honors 111, because the course is so reading intensive and it is primarily centered around these texts that we're reading to get a picture of civilizations and how they have evolved over time. Much of what we'll be doing is textual evidence, but you may find yourself, particularly as you write some of these longer papers, including statistical evidence or drawing in material from outside sources. And so this information could be not just textual evidence, but really all sorts of evidence. And the strength of your arguments ultimately is going to rest upon the strength of your evidence. So how convincing your writing is will depend on what types of information you're using to support those arguments and to support your overarching thesis statement. Okay, so I'm going to go through some practical guidance on integrating evidence into your writing. And some of this will seem straightforward, but it's important to just kind of remind ourselves of this and remind ourselves of the role of evidence and how we choose, the best evidence to include in our writing. So the first thing we would note is there are many different types of evidence. As I said, for Honors 111, the majority of what you're doing is rooted in textual evidence. You might have even seen this in class where someone will make a point or offer an observation. I'll say, okay, well, where do you see that? Or can you give an example of that within the text? And that's what I hope you'll be doing with your writing as well, is when you make an assertion or you offer your point of view, there's some sort of textual evidence to back that up. But there are many different kinds of evidence, right? There are many different types of evidence that you could include in your writing. So historical facts constitute a type of evidence. Maybe you're making a comparison between something that's happening today and something that's happening previously in human history. And so the historical events that you're recounting are the evidence that you're utilizing to support your argument. It could be statistics or empirical evidence, right? You could be making an argument or offering a generalization about some trend in human behavior. How many people utilize social media on a daily basis? And there, you can't just make that assertion without providing some empirical evidence, and there's probably empirical evidence out there that you could draw in to support that argument. It could be quotes from secondary sources. So, for instance, the texts that we're reading by and large are primary sources. You're reading primary materials that are, in some cases thousands of years old, but much has been written about them. So if you went and found an article about Inanna or the Odyssey or the Tao, and it was a secondary source offering commentary on that primary source, then that quote would be a form of evidence. It could be, agreeing with or lending some sort of support to an argument that you're making, and that could be a form of evidence. Anecdotes and personal experience can constitute a form of evidence. In general, it can be a good kind of hook for your reader. You can talk about some sort of personal experience you had and then generalize up utilizing some of these other forms of evidence like statistics or empirical evidence. So you can talk about, your experience with social media and the role that it plays in your life, and then offer broader evidence. But you generally do not want to have an argument that is solely based on anecdotes or personal experience. But it can play a role. It can play a role in your writing. And also expert opinion. So some of you, are studying things with professors who do research on subjects, and they might be asked by media or television or a radio interviewer to go on TV or the radio or appear in the newspaper and offer their opinion on some issue. And the reason that they're being asked is because they have expertise in a certain area. And so just like our media outlets include, people who have expertise in certain areas to lend credence to their reporting, you can utilize expert opinion in your writing to lend credence to your arguments. So there's a whole host of different types of evidence that you can include in your writing. A couple things that you should consider in choosing the evidence for your paper, for your essays, for the things that you are writing. The very first question that you should ask is whether or not the evidence is relevant to the argument laid out in your thesis statement or the main idea of that paragraph in which the evidence is going to be included. So you know from the past lesson on paragraph structure that paragraphs should be concise, they should be focused, and they should be centered around a main idea. And the evidence in those paragraphs should be related to the main idea. And ideally, the main idea should be related to that thesis statement, the overarching argument. The very first micro lesson that we had is on the thesis statement. So if you look at the evidence you're thinking about including and you can't draw a clear link between what you're going to be saying and what evidence you'll be including and the overarching argument or the main idea of the paragraph, then maybe that's not the best evidence. You also have to evaluate the evidence itself. So perhaps it's a quote or a statistic or a historical event. As you look at what you're going to be including, particularly with quotes and material that you're drawing in from other sources, you have to first ask about the clarity. So ask yourself, okay, if I integrate this into the middle of a paragraph about my writing, about my point of view, is it going to be clear to the reader how it's related? And so that could affect the overall credibility of the evidence if it's not clear, if it's not framed in a clear way. Is it informative? Does it lend some new information to the discussion that actually enhances the reader's understanding and makes the points that you are offering in your writing clearer and more persuasive? And then you also have to ask yourself about the reputation of the source. Right? This is one of the reasons why when I talk about anecdote or personal experience, I'm saying that's perfectly okay to include in some respect. It engages the reader and makes the narrative more personal, but it's not the sole thing that you want to rely on because everyone's personal experience is different. And it's very difficult to generalize from personal experience up to broad trends in human behavior. So reputation could be, is this from a source that looks reputable? I see a lot of students citing Wikipedia, and I think Wikipedia is valuable. I consult Wikipedia probably on a daily basis, but I always I look at it skeptically when I see it cited in a paper because Wikipedia is open source, and so anybody can edit Wikipedia. And the thing that's really frustrating when I see Wikipedia cited is that Wikipedia cites its sources. So if there's a claim that's made in Wikipedia, there's usually a citation to some other sort of source. And I'd much rather, a student encounter a claim on Wikipedia and then investigate the claim and cite that original source that Wikipedia is citing. So that is something to keep in mind, is the reputation of certain sources can impact whether or not the evidence is credible for your reader. And so things like, scholarly research that's been peer-reviewed, newspaper articles that cite statistics and facts and evidence, and they're reputable, they're viewed as pretty objective, unbiased journalistic outlets. Those are good things to be citing in terms of evidence and credibility, but just be mindful of that. And in particular, be very, very wary of information that you encounter on random internet websites that are not connected to larger outlets, that are not a product of research done by experts, but just kind of things that you find in Google searches. Really look at the website and say, what is it? And what is its motivation? And what is its expertise? What authority does it have to make this claim that I'm going to integrate into my writing? Because ultimately, the evidence that you include in your writing to support your arguments will be the basis upon which your reader judges your credibility as a writer. So the evidence kind of reflects back on you. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so your criteria for choosing evidence. These are the criteria that I'll be utilizing to evaluate your weekly writing assignments this week. So pay careful attention to these. The first thing is that evidence should be framed in relation to the thesis statement. So as you read through your work, as you kind of proofread before you submit your assignment, think about whether or not it's clear to the reader how the evidence that you're including connects back to that overarching claim or argument that you're making in your thesis statement. Right? So this is an area in which your thesis statement being clear is really important. If you don't have a clear thesis statement, you won't have good guidance in terms of what evidence to include in backing up that thesis statement. The second criteria, the second thing to keep in mind is to contextualize and introduce the evidence for your reader. So think about, the evidence-based claim that you're going to make is always kind of, it's an interjection into your own writing, into your own voice, right? So you might want to kind of lead up to it. You could say, for instance, numerous places in the text refer to X, Y, or Z, and then bring in the evidence. Or if you're integrating outside research, you could say, many researchers have studied the question of X, Y, or Z, and then you introduce the evidence-based claim. So you kind of prepare the reader for the fact that you're going to be introducing evidence to support your claim in your writing. And then lastly, paragraph or summarize as necessary. So this involves you making some choices. If you're integrating an outside source, if you're providing textual support, if you're talking about historical events, you really have to decide what is the most important aspect of the evidence and be discriminating in which evidence you include. So if it's a quote, you want to think about what is the most essential part of that quote, and you don't want to just kind of have this massive quote in which the reader has to go and find the evidence within it. Similarly, if you're talking about, historical events, or you're talking about statistics, you really want to zero in on what is the thing that really connects very well with my thesis statement, and make choices about what to include or what not to include on that basis. So paraphrasing is okay, putting it in your own words, summarizing, always. The direct quote can be good, but you always want to just make sure that you utilize it sparingly. And when you do use it, you're utilizing the most effective, most persuasive quote that you can. You're not just slapping words in to provide some kind of evidence or claim, but really be systematic and intentional in how you do that. And so I have an example for you here. This is the type of thing that if there were not outside evidence sorted, I would be kind of skeptical of it. I often see claims made about contemporary society, contemporary events, the way that people behave, and it's this kind of nowadays we see this, but once upon a time we saw something completely different. And in general, I like to see those backed up with some sort of evidence, right? So this person is making a claim about the ways in which Americans and American society have changed, but they are actually citing evidence to back that up. So they say, today Americans are too self-centered. Even our families don't matter as much anymore as they once did. Other people and activities take precedence. In fact, the evidence shows that most American families no longer eat together, preferring instead to eat on the go while rushing to the next appointment. And etc. Right? They go on to talk about how sit-down meals and connecting with people over food is very important, and it's a way in which we connect, and families are brought together, and group identity is reinforced. But if they didn't have that claim, right? If they didn't have that evidence that I imagine connects back to a larger argument about changes in American society, then I'd be a little bit skeptical of this. I'd say, well, what is your evidence that American families no longer eat together? That seems to be perhaps, the experience of busy people, or that's certainly my experience, but I don't know if that's a general trend across the United States as a whole. So it's really great that they've brought in the evidence. They've paraphrased it. They've put in their own words. So there's not a big clunky 5-sentence quote from this research. They've put it in their own words and essentialized out the most crucial insight. And they have prepared their reader for the claim, right? So they say, in fact, the evidence shows, and then they move into the claim. So it's just really well done. And it's the type of thing that if you were to bring in outside research in your own writing, that's the type of thing that I would be looking for. So it's very well done. Now, I have some resources here if you're looking for additional guidance on utilizing evidence, if this is an area in which you struggle a little bit. So the Purdue Online Writing Lab, they have a resource for virtually everything, and they do in fact have one for utilizing evidence, particularly in relation to argumentative writing. And then the Lynchburg College Writing Center also has some good resources on evidence, different types of evidence, and how to think about including evidence. So we'll wrap up there, and I encourage you to go over and look at the writing prompt for this week and think about how to utilize evidence in responding to it for this week's prompts. So I look forward to reading your work. Thanks.